Well, hello everyone and welcome to my library. If you're new here, hello, my name is Cinzia. And if you're not new here and you're one of my lovely regulars, hi, how are you? I hope you're doing splendidly. Today's video is sponsored by BetterHelp, and today we're going to be talking about Augustus, propaganda, and Hercules. I know, I cover Hercules a lot on this channel. I've already done 2 very extensive videos on Hercules, which would make one assume that I'm really into Hercules. I'm not. I do love the Disney film. It is my favourite Disney film. Don't get me wrong. However, I'm not really that into him, but he seems to crop up in everything I cover. The other day, I was with my friend talking about the return of Augustus, or rather Octavian, after he came back from the Battle of Actium, and I found it really funny, and in that I decided to make a whole video about it, but I realised that Hercules features a lot, and it's just a thing. So here is my 3rd video on Hercules, but rather focusing on Augustus, the relation of Augustus with Hercules, and the propaganda that ensued. So I'm taking you all the way back to August of 29 BCE, when Octavian celebrated 3 consecutive days of a triple triumph. The triple triumph was in celebration of his victories in Dalmatia, at Actium, and in Egypt. So born Caesar Octavius and adopted by Julius Caesar under the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavius, Octavian, following his Actium victory, and after attending to several matters in the eastern provinces, returned to Rome and entered the triple triumph in 29 BCE, where he restored the Republic and was given the honorific title Augustus in 27 BCE. So it flitters in and out between Octavian or Augustus, but for those completely unfamiliar with ancient Rome, they are the same person. The Roman triumph, for those who are curious, was one of the ancient Rome's most important civic and sacred institutions. These triumphs consisted of spectacular processions that proceeded through the streets of the imperial city, celebrating Rome's military victories, the courage of its soldiers, and the favour of the gods that afforded them these victories. They were also conducted to celebrate one of the highest honours a Roman man could achieve, and yes, only Roman men could get it, the designation of the triumphator. Whilst the origins of the ceremony are quite obscure and likely adopted from Greek and Etruscan cultures, one thing was for certain in many Roman minds. The triumph was a sacred Roman celebration, as, according to Plutarch, the first man to ever enjoy one was the founder of Rome himself, Romulus. Behind the triumphator would be the spoils of war, from exotic marbles and bronzes to prisoners of war, a fate which Cleopatra avoided herself by, taking herself out. The ancient Roman foundation myths were significant in the celebration and perpetuation of collective identities within the context of the empire, with many ethnic identities based on the notion of a common past. Virgil's Aeneid offers 2 ultimate sources for Augustus's authority: the mythic origin of Rome and the divine sphere, and the latter was very important considering that the monarchy was at that time in Rome linked to tyranny and oppression, thanks to the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, who was a tyrant that illegally usurped authority. Because of this, the aristocratic ruling class of the Republic were pretty damn suspicious of anyone who rose to power, and this hostility towards kingship, coupled with Julius Caesar's king-like pretensions at the time, are basically what led to his assassination, amongst other things. So kingship and any associations with it in ancient Rome were off the cards when it came to asserting and establishing one's authority as a leader, but divinity was still game. You see, in ancient Rome, politics and religion were closely connected, with politics seeking to preserve and increase the foundation of Rome by employing the authority of a deeply rooted past. The deeds of the ancestors played an essential role in Roman thinking and politics, and Roman leaders were evaluated in terms of the intent of their ancestors. Yes, we're all working backwards here. Rome was basically on a time loop all of the time. So Augustus's ancestral credentials were pretty damn impressive. According to Julii, Romulus, Julius, and Augustus all came from Aeneas, and the famed divinity of the Julii stemmed from their descendant from Aeneas' mother, Venus, meaning Augustus has some of the most impressive nepotism I've ever heard of. Every official in Rome had to justify his decisions in terms of those taken in the past by others of his own line, and a backwards-looking process drove all authority in ancient Rome because, according to imperial propaganda, the life of Rome was an internal and broken thread. Basically, see it as Groundhog Day. Everyone acted in accordance with what happened before, which is why we have very consistent celebrations and festivities repeated on every year, such as the Ides of March, etc. As historian Gerke explains, these foundation myths did not derive their power and vitality solely from references to the past, but from their significance to the present and the future. Therefore, for the ancient Romans, myth and history and the present existed in a single continuum. And this is important based on how emperors and leaders behaved and when people picked particular incidents or celebrations or festivities to enact certain actions in ancient Rome, which, again, beware the Ides of March. Anyway, Augustus's authority was legitimised through his mythical historical past and then subsequently the writings of Augustan poets, Virgil being the most significant. The Aeneid reinforces the idea Augustus as the telos of Roman history and the ultimate head of the secular authority signifies the will of the gods. Although Augustus is mentioned only 3 times in the Aeneid, in Jupiter's prophecy, Anchises' revelation of Rome's future, and in the description of Aeneas' shield, I see the shield of Achilles, it's all taken from the same thing, Augustus is present in the subtext in many passages of the Aeneid. So in the 3 mentioned passages, Virgil elevates Roman history and Augustus to a divine level. As Grave explains, Virgil presents Augustus's monarchy as an indispensable and natural part of Roman history and Jupiter's will, which is why people had to start reevaluating their relationship with monarchical rule in ancient Rome when Augustus was rising to power. You see, the Principate is justified and legitimised by a long tradition of Roman kingship and by the plan of the highest god, according to Virgil's Aeneid. Thus, Augustus's new form of government had a double foundation: history and divine providence. It's just as Hannah Adretta said, all authority derives from this foundation, binding every act back to the sacred beginning of Roman history, adding, as it were, to every single moment the whole weight of the past. You see, Augustus only got to his power and his significance in the Roman Empire thanks to history, mythology, and people's emphasis on these factors. But, according to many authors, Augustus manipulated political ceremonies and exploited the visual media in such a way as to monopolise for himself and his intended successor the image of the triumphator. For starters, Augustus potentially orchestrated his association with the hero Hercules by repeating myth history, as it were. You see, the annual celebration of Hercules' defeat of Cacus, it's spelled like this. I've heard multiple people pronounce it very different ways. I'm going to call it Cacus, but again, don't take me for word with it. Anyway, the annual celebration of Hercules' defeat of Cacus and the founding of the Ara Maxima took place on the 12th of August at the Ara Maxima itself in the Forum Boarium. Octavian entered the city of Rome on the 13th of August 29 BCE, thereby reenacting the entrance of the triumphant Hercules entering the land of what would be Rome in the myth. Before then, Augustus began his 3-day triple triumph. So in effect, by entering on basically the day after Hercules did, Augustus was signalling that he was repeating history, and therefore it had significance. It associated him with the hero Hercules. Additionally, the transformation from republic to principate under Augustus decisively altered the triumph as the Roman institution. You see, after Augustus did his triple triumph thing, he decided to put his foot down a bit here. You see, Augustus understood that the triumphs and the popularity of the triumphator that ensued could potentially threaten the emperor. So he made a statement. After his sixth and final triumph, that being the Triple Triumph, Augustus refused all triumphs that the Senate decreed to him and avoided any formal reception from the city by entering the city unannounced and only at night time, which therefore set a precedent for anyone else wanting to follow. Furthermore, following the consolidation of his power in January 27 BCE, Augustus enforced severe restrictions on the triumphs awarded to men, and only 4 other triumphs took place during the 40.5 years of his reign. But was Augustus really tooting his own horn? Did he really try to emulate Hercules? And was this all about, protecting the ego? Well, to answer these questions, we need to examine the historical connection between Augustus and Hercules in far more depth. But before we do that, I should like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, BetterHelp. Now, this sponsor means a lot to me personally, because if you've been following my channel, or either of my channels, for any period of time, you'll know that I've actually been using BetterHelp for over a year and a half, long before this opportunity. So I love the fact that I have an opportunity to be sponsored by them, and I cannot praise it enough. You see, when I found out that I secured my PhD placement back in March of last year, I knew I would need therapy to support my academic journey this time around, because I didn't have any in my undergraduate and master's, and this was a big one, so I needed help. And I was lucky enough to not only be partnered with a fantastic therapist first time round, but a therapist who had serendipitously just completed her own PhD in psychology and thus understood exactly what I was about to go through myself. My therapist has helped me through my anxiety, my depression, my ADHD diagnosis, and also my struggles with dyslexia. She's covered everything with me and been there all the way, and I hope that she can be there throughout my entire PhD journey. If you think you're feeling depressed, stressed, anxious, or overwhelmed, BetterHelp is here to help you. BetterHelp makes therapy accessible, affordable, and convenient for those who need it. Without exception, all 20,000 plus therapists on the platform are licensed, trained, experienced, and accredited psychologists, marriage and family therapists, clinical social workers, and board licensed professional counsellors. BetterHelp makes it really easy to fit a therapist to you. All you need to do is fill out a questionnaire to help them assess your specific needs, and then you get matched with a therapist in as little as 48 hours. Then all you have to do is schedule video or phone sessions with your therapist, and you can exchange unlimited messages with your therapist about anything and everything, and all of this is completely confidential. And if the therapist you're matched with isn't a match for you at the start, you can request a new therapist at no additional charge at any time. So you join the 3 million plus people who have taken charge of their mental health with an experienced BetterHelp therapist. If you're interested in starting your BetterHelp journey today, then get 10% off your first month by going to betterhelp.com/Cinzia, which I've put on the screen and is linked in the description box below. So thank you BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. And now let's get into the depths of mythology with Augustus, and Hercules. So many believe Octavian's decision to hold his triple triumph, celebrating among other victories, his victory over Antony and Cleopatra, to coincide with the day of Hercules' annual festival at the Ara Maxima. And this was seen as potentially a deliberate attempt to usurp Antony's association with Hercules and his proposed adoption by Julius Caesar. But that said, if he were that eager to associate himself with Hercules, why enter the day after the festival of Hercules rather than the day of? Could it be perhaps that Augustus wasn't that interested in pursuing his connection and instead had it thrust upon him by poets and writers alike? Well, let's take a look at some of these writers. First, let's look at Horace's Odes 3.3. The turbulent leader of the restless Adriatic, nor the great hand of bolt-bearing Joves, should the world crumble and collapse, the ruins will strike him undaunted. By this art, Pollux and wandering Hercules strived for and reached the fiery heights, between whom a reclining Augustus will drink nectar with purple mouth. Augustus was alive when Horace wrote this ode, but in it, Horace signals to Augustus's inevitable deification. Horace frequently wrote of Castor and Pollux, Romulus, Bacchus, and Hercules, who were 5 demigods that achieved divine status through virtue and earthly deeds. In fact, all of them, bar Castor, are mentioned in this ode alone, and Augustus's name appears very close to Hercules, suggesting bonds between them. Additionally, Horace's odes offer a direct comparison of the deeds of Hercules and Augustus by aligning Augustus's campaign of Spain in 24 BCE with Hercules' defeat of Geryon. Said just now in the manner of Hercules, O plebs, to have sought the laurel won by death, Caesar returns to his penates from the Spanish shore victorious. So what about the myths of Hercules? Well, they were pretty popular in Augustus's time, but two separate and seemingly unrelated myths of Hercules flourished in Rome during this period. The first myth was of triumphant Hercules' defeat of the robber monster Cacus, and the other was of the cross-dressed Hercules who was enslaved by the Lydian queen Omphale. In his thesis, Matthew Law argues that these myths addressed more broadly two separate anxieties about faltering normative power structures in Rome at the end of the 1st century BCE. The myth of Hercules and Cacus addressed concerns about political succession and transition, specifically how Augustus and Augustus's Rome fit within the narrative of Roman history, whilst the Hercules and Omphale myth confronted the growing fear about Roman masculinity in an era that was witnessing the rise of powerful women at home and abroad. You see, widespread anxieties marked the first decade of Augustan period after emerging from decades-long civil war between Augustus and Mark Antony. The Romans were in need of a heroic figure to soothe their nerves, and that hero became Hercules. You see, the myth of Hercules and Cacus is typical of a hero story, and it follows on from the story of the Labours, which I've covered in depth in another video. After successfully stealing Geryon's cattle, Hercules passes through Rome and comes face to face with a monstrous robber, Cacus. There are two versions of this myth, one darker than the other, but the sentiments and the dynamics between hero and the monster remain the same. The name Cacus is believed to derive from the ancient Greek that means bad or evil. In Book 8 of Virgil's Aeneid, we have Evander, a man who rules the city of Palatium, which happens to be on the site of future Rome. Evander tells Aeneas the story of how Hercules defeated the foul-mouthed, half-human monster who lived in a cave which rays of sun never reached, which many believe now is actually situated on the Aventine Hill. Cacus was a son of Vulcan, and Cacus vomited from his mouth his father's black fire. His cave was drenched in human blood, and the heads of men were proudly nailed on the doors and hung there pale and rotting. The local people were terrified of the monster, until one day Hercules came along. You see, he had strayed into the area looking for the missing cattle, which had dispersed after Juno, the Roman version of Hera, sent a gadfly down to scatter the cattle that he had successfully stolen from Geryon. By this point of the story, Hercules had found them grazing quite peacefully in a valley, drinking from a river, but as he was rounding them up, Cacus spotted them. Evander tells Aeneas that Cacus stole 4 bulls and 4 heifers from the herd, and in an attempt to throw Hercules off the trail, he dragged the cows and bulls by their tails towards the caves, so their hoof prints faced the opposite direction. However, the cows that were left behind gave Cacus away. You see, they understood that they were missing some of their companions, and they started lowing in distress. In response, one of the stolen heifers lowed back from the depths of the cave, thwarting Cacus's plans, and the furious Hercules followed the sound of the crying cow. Realizing Hercules was on his way, Cacus blocked off the entrance of the cave with a massive boulder. But Hercules merely actually decided to remove the top of the cave and attacked Cacus from above, throwing rocks and tree branches down. In an attempt to defend himself, Cacus vomited black smoke and fire to conceal himself, but brave Hercules threw himself down into the cave and leapt through the flames and smoke until he reached the monster himself and squeezed him so hard by the neck that his eyes were forced out of his sockets, and he drained him until his throat bled dry. Then Hercules unblocked the cave, releasing the cattle, and dragged the body of Cacus to showcase the monster's defeat to the locals, who celebrated Hercules with an altar, the Ara Maxima to be precise. The myth of Cacus and Hercules can be found in Ovid's Fasti, Propertius's poetry, and Livy's history of Rome. But none of these writers actually created the myth. Though there's no clearly accepted original source of the myth, the earliest extant literary sources are found in the 1st century BCE, and its floruit coincides with the ascendance of Octavian and his reign as Augustus. However, this does not mean that the myth is a byproduct of his reign. The myth bears a few similarities to Greek myth. For example, Hermes' theft of Apollo's cattle and the lesser-known myth of Sisyphus' stealing of the mares of Diomedes. But as you can tell from their names, the thief in the Greek stories was not a monster to be defeated, but a cunning protagonist, Sisyphus and Hermes. Propertius and Ovid follow Virgil's prototype, with Propertius parodying it and Ovid almost reciting it verbatim. Livy's rendition of the story differs from Virgil in that he paints Cacus not as a monster, but an ordinary shepherd man, who outwitted the great hero by driving the oxen across the Tiber. Like Virgil's Cacus, the shepherd drags the oxen backwards in an attempt to confuse Hercules, but the one oxen gives the trick away as per, and Cacus is killed by Hercules at the entrance of the cave in a vain attempt to hold the hero back. Hercules doesn't vanquish a monster in Livy's story, but he is still honoured because of a prophecy. Livy claims that Evander, the same Evander, who was the king at the time, prophesied would one day become a god, and therefore built Hercules a shrine, the Ara Maxima, and Hercules joined him and 2 other prominent families for a sacrifice in his name and a feast following the death of the shepherd. Though the myth of Hercules and Cacus is not very well known today, it was significant for the foundation story of the Ara Maxima, which is the oldest cult of Hercules in Rome. It was important for Virgil to have Evander tell Aeneas the myth of Hercules, because Aeneas, the Trojan who founded the land that would eventually become Rome, was seen as a second Hercules. Thus, Aeneas served as the embodiment of Rome and therefore Augustus. The traits ascribed to Aeneas by Virgil were central to Augustan ideology and values. Octavian, as we know, marched triumphantly into Rome on the day following the celebration of the Festival of Hercules. Virgil ensured Aeneas, in his epic poem, also arrived on the site of the future Rome during the same commemoration. On the following day, the same day Octavian's triumph began, Aeneas receives the shield from Venus, a shield which features upon it a depiction of the Battle of Actium and Augustus' triumph. In Virgil's poem, Hercules' defeat of the etymologically evil Cacus foreshadows Aeneas' defeat of Turnus, which in turn metaphorically foreshadowed Augustus' victory over Antony. But that had already actually happened, but is a myth foreshadowing a future event that already happened when he was writing it. Thus, Hercules was for Aeneas what Aeneas was for Augustus. But what about the other Hercules myth? The myth of Omphale and Hercules. This gives us a wildly different depiction of the hero. You see, having completed his labours, Hercules went to Oechalia, whose king, Eurytus, was holding an archery competition, for which the prize was his daughter, Iole. Eurytus had taught Hercules how to wield a bow, so Hercules was pretty damn confident that he would win this competition. And as the competition progressed, he was winning, and Eurytus, in panic, withdrew his daughter Iole as the prize, for fear that Hercules would murder her like he did his first wife, Megara. Eurytus' son Iphitos, who was a friend of Hercules since the days of the Argonauts, begged his father to reconsider. But whilst his father was reconsidering, Iphitos decided to ask Hercules for a bit of a favour. He asked Hercules if he could help him track down a horse thief named Autolycus, and Hercules agreed. Until he was yet overcome again with another blinding, insane, murderous rampage in which he threw Hephaestus over the walls of the city of Tyrians and immediately killed him. It's a repeat of Megara all over again. You see, he was afraid for his daughter, when in really, he should have been afraid for his son. So Hercules found himself needing to pay yet another penalty for his sins, so he visited the Delphic oracle Xenoclea to ask for her wisdom. Xenoclea told Hercules that to pay for his crime, he would have to serve the Libyan queen Omphale as her slave for a whole year. Omphale wasn't letting Hercules off lightly and decided to make the entire experience utterly humiliating for him. She took the most masculine hero known to the world and forced him to dress as a woman and weave with her maidens. However, she did let him perform a couple of more traditionally masculine duties during the period, such as capturing the mischievous forest-dwelling brothers known as the Cercopes. After the year was over, Omphale set Hercules free and married him. Unlike the myth of Cacus, which was largely a Roman or Etruscan invention, largely speaking, the myth of Omphale is largely Greek, dating all the way back to the 1st century BCE, and was told by both Apollodorus and Diodorus Siculus. However, the Roman tale differs from the Greek myth in that Hercules in the Greek myth remains largely Herculean in himself. The female dress code, which is so heavily emphasised in the Roman story, isn't present in the Greek ones, aside from a reference to an item of women's clothing that was exchanged between Hercules and Omphale, and a woman's headdress. There's no such emphasis on Hercules being dressed as a woman. You see, the Romans went really hard on this idea of cross-dressing Hercules, and arguably, that feature is unique to the Augustan retellings of the myth. The Omphale myth was seen as the most degrading of all stories about a hero. Not only was he dressed as a woman, heaven forbid that a man would dress as a woman and thus lose his masculinity, but he had to serve one as well. My god. So we have here two very different myths. One myth celebrated Hercules, whilst the other presented him as a servile, weak man. And yet both were popular at the same time during the Augustan period, a period in which Augustus was related to Hercules. Why? Well, Hercules was considered an exemplar of Augustus, one which he personally embraced. But these are actually two different Hercules, according to a lot of scholars out there. Let's explore that. Okay, so the first Hercules acts as a representative for Augustus, or the ideology of Augustan regime. The second Hercules, for many scholars, seems to represent another main player of the Civil War, Mark Antony, and more specifically, the emasculated Mark Antony and his relationship with the overbearing Cleopatra. However, there are those who believe that this reading isn't really conducive or likely. I mean, look at it this way. Augustus arose as the new Hercules, the champion of Italy, in the form of the deified Romulus, but these different readings of Hercules traps Hercules in an ideological tug of war. When Hercules battles Cacus, he represents Augustus going against Antony. When Hercules is deified in other myths, he represents Augustus. But when he serves Omphale, Hercules suddenly represents Antony? Doesn't really make sense. In an alternative take on the reading, Loar argues that the Omphale myth depicts the sadistic gaze of male aggressors who wish to unman Hercules. But being a paragon of uncompromising masculinity, Hercules' masculinity cannot be penetrated by the external threats of femininity or feminine control. Thus, Loar writes, the Hercules Omphale myth may have been engineered in the Augustan period originally to mollify concerns about threatened Roman masculinity. But Hercules will come to address other related anxieties in decades and centuries to come. But there are others who also read the employment of this myth as a reflection of the princeps' own transformation in the years following his victory at Actium. Octavian, the ruthless warlord, underwent a metamorphosis when he became Augustus. One was ruthless, the other, now Augustus, was the overseer of morals and the author of the Pax Augusta. Despite rumours of his effeminacy, Augustus left behind the image he created for himself during the civil wars. He didn't want to be known as his oath-bearing warlord. He even said so himself, that he removed 80 statues of himself from Rome. But much like Hercules, no matter how hard he tried, he could never escape his past and what he was known for by the world around him. Thank you for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video once again. And also a massive shout out to the following patrons: Janice, Andy, Arch Capitalist, Zach, Jack, Chris, Brian, Erica, Barry, Nicholas, Robert, Alison, Bill, Laura, Cora, Andrea, Sam, Crystal, Eleanor, and IS. Thank you all for being my top tier patrons, and thank you to all of my patrons. As you know, I did a recent Patreon reshuffle. There are new rewards out there, and stay tuned because I will be updating about all my podcasts. Yes, there will be 2 podcasts, so I really appreciate you all for your support over there. I will see you soon for another video, and remember, books save lives, so keep reading.